This session is From Attacks to Action, Building a Usable Threat Model to Drive Defensive Choices. And I'll send it over to Tony.
Thank you very much. And thank you all for joining us here today. It's great to see a packed house. I'm not used to a room that's so wide. So if I don't make eye contact down to one corner or another, it's not that I don't care about you. It's just that I don't think I can swivel my head that quickly and take in everything all at once. So I'm Tony Sager, Chief Technologist for something called the Council on CyberSecurity. That's an independent, relatively new nonprofit company dedicated to the notion of best practices in cybersecurity by people, in technology, and in policy. And this is something I decided to take on with a partner, the Honorable Jane Lute, the former Deputy Secretary of the Department of Homeland Security. And we are lifelong public servants who were leaving public service for a variety of reasons and decided we needed a way to get involved in the cause of improving security for everyone, because that's the kind of things that we've done for our entire careers. So I'm going to give you a little story. This is not a deeply technical talk. There'll be one equation in the entire talk. But it's a little story of how I think we need to operate as a community. How do we work together? How do we solve some of these problems? You know, you saw in the excellent talk from Mark at Rapid 7 previously was about looking across the large scale of the internet and seeing problems. Well, guess what? Those problems have been there a long, long time. And the question is not, are there problems? The question is, what are we going to do about them? And we're not going to get there by waiting for someone else to save us. So I'll talk to you a little bit about the way I think of this problem. I'll tell you a little bit about the career that I've had. I'm one of the, I think, longest surviving cybersecurity defender guys, approaching 40 years now in this business. And the experiences that I've had shape the way I approach the problem. So I'll share a little bit of that with you so that you get a sense for what I'm all about. Let me put this up just to set a level here in the conversation. So I'm an old guy in computer security from the mid-70s. There's lots of different models, but this is what I learned, right? It's a very simple conceptual model about threat. We actually are all, at some level, we're in the risk business, right? You know, I grew up, though, in the first of those variables, vulnerability. So I'll read the equation to you. You don't have to solve it, because no one else has either. Risk is a function of those three primary variables: vulnerability, threat, consequence. And a friend of mine maybe put countermeasures on there, but I wouldn't have done that. But it's a way to manipulate. Those variables, why do you have a model like that? Because it helps you conceptualize both a way to understand the problem, but also to think about how to solve it. And my experience has been people that understand vulnerability, for example, are often clueless about consequence. And those variables come from different places, are measured differently, and often have different implications. And the challenge for really senior people, right, senior decision makers, politicians, military leaders, the folks that I've tried to serve in my career, struggle every day with this intuitive equation. They have to bring these things together, right? Those really smart people are telling me, I got a gazillion flaws in my software. What should I do about it? And somebody else is telling me, bad guys really care about me and they're trying to do bad things to me. How am I going to bounce those two against each other? Because I got to pay to solve some of these problems. And other people are telling me, and I know that I have a mission to fulfill. I have a business to run. And what are the implications? What are the consequences? And so pulling all these together is a challenge, and it's one of the great sort of conceptual problems that really smart people have been thinking about for decades without a solution. But I put it up here to help us think a little bit about conceptualizing the problem. So in the mid-70s, I started my career in this business. I was hired into the National Security Agency, recently retired 2 years ago, 35 years proudly serving my country at the NSA, all of it in defense. When I started, the career field was known as communications security. Right, that was the thing. We were protecting the communications. And that's the way we thought of the problem. And it came down to, what we would call today confidentiality and a game of mathematics. Right? We use mathematics, cryptography, to protect information, to protect the communications. And the real game was, were our mathematicians smarter than their mathematicians, right? Could we dream up algorithms and randomization and protection schemes that could withstand the attack by the other guy? This notion of like this everyday fight on the internet didn't exist. We didn't have that kind of a model. So I started my career as a mathematician looking at US algorithms, randomization, key management schemes, and things like that. And then came the personal computing revolution. Some of you aren't even old enough to remember those days. But I figured out the scam in 1981. I could get the government to buy me an Apple II Plus to have on my desk. I was hooked forever to be a part of this community, right, which didn't even exist at the time. The notion of computer security. Now, why would the government buy a geek like me an Apple II Plus? because we were just starting to see the introduction of microprocessors into really high security things. Okay, so in those days, the kinds of problems that I was working on to try and solve were things like use control for nuclear weapons, right? Communications between the president and other heads of state. These were the kind of problems we were trying to solve. And something, this fluky, flaky stuff called software, it's not good enough for high security. That's the way people talk, right? If we really cared about the security of this and the safety of it, we'd build it in hardware, by golly. Why would we do that? It's expensive. Yeah, but hardware we can control, right? We can test every transistor and gate. We can model it. We can fail it in a simulation and see if it still works. That was the notion, right? I could control the environment. So I spent my early days on that vulnerability part, learning the craft, thinking about that problem. But what I was really doing was understanding the threat. Okay, so think of those days, right? 60s, 70s, and 80s. I know some of you are not that old. For those of you that are, you might remember those quaint old days where we only had one enemy. Anybody remember that? One enemy, right? It was big country against big country. One enemy. How much did we know about the threat? Very little, right? The other bad guy was a closed society. They didn't tell us much. There was no CERT bulletins. There was no threat feeds. There was no information flow about how bad people are attacking each other every minute of every day. There was no such thing. So how did we figure out what was going on? Well, you paid geeky guys like me to go in the back room and pretend to be the bad guy, right? Let's attack ourselves before the real bad guys do, and then we'll fix all that stuff, okay? And we could do it as part of the development cycle before the stuff ever got in the field. In those days, it would take 10 plus years to build an army radio, right? That sounds pretty leisurely by today's standards, right? How many of you work on anything for 10 years anymore? None of you, okay? Things change too quickly. But the idea was, we need to understand the overall risk. We better get a handle on the vulnerabilities. To do so, we have to pretend to be the threat. Now, when you talk about vulnerabilities, though, you're usually talking about technical issues, right? Flaws in software is kind of the classic in our business. Weaknesses in protocols, that's a big part of vulnerability. Threat is a softer, fuzzier sort of a thing to get a handle on. Why? Because threat is about adversaries and what they care about, their intentions, their capability, right? And there's lots of them out there today. And so you can't just measure threat as a technical issue. There is a huge content component here that you have to understand if you're going to make sense of this problem. And consequence is always in the eye of the beholder, and it's usually not one of you. It's usually a very senior person who's running a business, running a military operation, et cetera, right? They're the ones that have to live with consequences. And folks like us speculate all day about the bad things that could happen. But at the end of the day, people that run businesses expect to run the business. Military guys that expect to project force and do things, they're going to do it. But they want to be well informed so that they're taking a knowing risk. So this is the world that I grew up in. And it sort of echoes through the world that we have today. So quick summary of my career then, 35 plus years. The first third, I would say, was primarily as a technical analyst, which I think represents many of you, right? Learning the craft of both mathematics, computer science, and then figuring out how things break, how to make them break, how to understand how they break. The middle third of my career, I was asked to move into management jobs. Maybe that was a sign they didn't think I was good enough technically. I'm not quite sure, but I took the hint and went with it. And when you're a manager of such things, right, you worry about things like efficiency. Are we doing a good job? Are my people well trained? How long does it take us? Are we writing good reports? Are we informing people afterwards? So I got to organize the business at NSA. And I'd say the capstone job of my career, I ran all the defensive operational security people within the defensive mission, information assurance at NSA. So if you've heard of things like the NSA Red Team, the Blue Team, folks like that, the people that looked at the cryptographic algorithms, the people that took the products apart in the back room, the people that worried about things like bugs in the walls, that was my group. All these amazingly talented people, and you guys are now the public reflection of that, right? Great, creative, clever minds who figure out how things break or how they can be made to break. So that was a great honor to have a job like that. So that's a great seat from which to see what's going on to measure these variables. Also in my job, I got a chance to work with, I will say, every government agency that I can think of, with 3 letters or not in their acronym, and how they go about this business of offense and attack and exploitation, right? Gathering of information. So I get a chance to see a lot of what goes on and see how bad guys operate, even if they work for us. To see how the red team operates when they pretend to be bad guys. So I have been blessed with this opportunity to see an amazing number of things, both in the government and commercially. So the last third of my career, I became consumed by something else. What are we going to do about this? Okay? Because what was happening, I realized we're seeing the same problems over and over and over again. The red team comes out, they knock the stuffings out of you. We go back 6 months later, exactly the same problems in place. Right? The blue team goes out, visits you, scans, helps your system administrators. 6 months later, the same problems are there. Same problems keep appearing within products over and over again. So what was clear to me was that just knowing about flaws is not good enough. Okay? And that's a trap that many of us in this business fall into. If I just go find another flaw and I'll publish the paper. See, I told them what's wrong. I've done my part, right? I'm done. How often does that actually get fixed? In my experience, rarely, right? So it occurred to me, if just knowing about the flaw was good enough, I would have been out of work 15 years ago. But that didn't happen. I got more work than ever. You guys all have work to do, right? So just knowing about flaws isn't good enough. So something's missing here. Why is it that we are not able to fix things that we know to be bad? Many of the things Mark pointed out in the previous talk, right? Those are not mysteries. Those are flaws that have been around a long time. So that's the thing that really consumed me for that last third. Coupled with a second factor. So remember the simple-minded, we thought it was like really hard work in the 70s when I started, but in contrast, it's relatively easy, right? One enemy, one threat. You need security? You go visit the US government. They'll take care of you, right? One supplier. Look where we are today. Go walk on the display floor, okay? We have an entirely different problem right now than the one that we had back then. We have what I call the fog of more problem, right? We had no choices. We had to make few decisions, and we didn't really know much about the bad guy. Now look at where we are today. Go to that display floor. You have a near infinite number of products to choose from, vendor claims to sort through, compliance, frameworks. You got it all. You want 10 opinions? Call 5 consultants, right? We are drowning in information to help us be better defenders. It's actually kind of embarrassing. Never in our history have we had so many choices, right? Lots of great choices. You can go to gigantic catalogs of security controls and frameworks and best practice gizmos and publications, websites, everywhere. Wow, we ought to be doing great. We're not, right? It's a sad fact. If we get to know each other personally, you'll figure out I'm one of the most optimistic people you'll ever meet. But it's true. The bad guys are getting better faster than we are as defenders. And that's not acceptable. That shouldn't be. But it is a fact of life. And I think a key factor is what I call the fog, right? We're drowning in this. Thousands of good things to do. Gazillions of feeds and information and stuff that you got to pay attention to or you can't keep up. That's a pretty challenging problem for all of us. And if we stand back from any one of us and we look at across like a giant sector like finance or whatever, or we look at the military or the DOD or the country or whatever, if we want to improve security for us all, do we really think every separate enterprise in the ecosystem is going to solve this problem by themselves? Not a chance. Not a chance. And why should you care? Because my company's pretty good, right? We got a lot of resources, we got really smart people, we bought these great tools. Guess what? You are hopelessly dependent upon lots of people, right? Every business partner, every supplier, everybody in your supply chain. And history tells us you don't even know who they are until some disaster happens. That's the nature of the world that we live in today, right? This is, when we say things like we need to work together and be a community, that's not simple bumper sticker stuff. That's a reality. That is a technical, physical reality. We are dependent upon each other. We have a shared problem. So we have no choice but to pursue shared solutions. Okay, so that's been kind of the way I've thought of this for some years now. And, I like to say, I'd like to think that I take action and not just talk, right? So starting in 2001, you can go to nsa.gov. I don't know if you ever have, but I was the manager who led the campaign to release to the public security guidance for NSA that we were developing for the DoD and the intelligence community. And I did that not because I'm a nice guy. I'm a nice guy, but that didn't why I do it. I did it because I realized we had a shared problem, right? My customers in the DoD don't get better till everybody gets better. Because nobody in the DoD gets paid, moved, supported, equipped, email. Nothing happens without partners across the entire ecosystem, many of whom we don't even know, right? Because it's several levels down and cascading dependency. So we have to improve across the board. So in this world of fog, that you as defenders now are stuck with these kind of gigantic problems, right? A couple of them. It's not good enough to watch your network. You've got to learn things that are happening all around the world, right? You have to extend your reach. You got to be able to look farther. You do that through friends, partners, information feeds, but you got to have a better picture. You got to have people you trust to help you cut through that foggy stuff, right? Because you can't keep up with it all. And again, you'll get all kinds of conflicting claims. Your boss wants one thing, the regulator wants a different thing, the vendor is telling you something else. You got to sort through that. You need help. You need trust. You need friends. But at the end of the day, remember this. You know, there's a huge industry out here of threat intelligence and all this great stuff, right? Amazing people learning amazing things about all kinds of threats, right? Including that fuzzy stuff about what they intend to do and their capabilities. It's great that you can get all this information, but threat information is not the destination here, right? It's a means to an end. I don't actually want to read all that stuff. What I want to know is what do I have to do about it so most of it goes away. This translation to action is what really defeats most of us here. And then, guess what? It's not good enough to learn this one time. You got to do it over and over and over again because the context changes. New information comes into your life. You don't have any choice. You got to keep up. And I will tell you in my experience with commercial industry, government, et cetera, across the board, it is the very, very rare enterprise that's big and bad and resourced enough to have the kind of talent in both numbers and skill that can understand and keep up with all these kinds of challenges. It is just a very daunting thing. And then here's like the worst part of the deal here, especially for you technical minds out there. Not only do you have to figure out the right thing to do in this world, right, this is your dilemma, then you have to do it, and then you got to prove to 15 people that you did the right thing, right? The inspector general, the auditor, the insurance folks, the lawyers, your boss, the PCI inspectors, assessors, and all. Oh my God, can I just do the right thing? No, you don't get a choice. You have to do things at scale, right? And you have to demonstrate that you've done the right things. So I've been focused now for a little while on what I call a threat model. How can I help us collectively solve this problem as opposed to everyone on their own figuring out how to solve this problem? So these are just a few of my thoughts on what would constitute a usable way to this. Because at the end of the day, remember, I can go find lists of thousands of good things to do, but that won't hold my boss's attention for more than 30 seconds. I can't afford to do them. I've got to prioritize. That's a fact of life. I've got to narrow down the number of things I do. Well, what would be my criteria for prioritizing? I want to stop what the bad guys are doing to me right now. Okay, there's tons of other stuff I got to fix, but I need to worry about what I got right now. Right? People are stealing from me. They're hurting me. They're causing us grief. I got to stop them. Here's the good and the bad news. We have all this information about threat that could help us understand better what they're doing so that we can translate this into action. But you really want to do it by data if you could. Right? If there were a magic wand, you'd say, I want data to drive this. I don't want to have to study 1 million data points. What I really want to know is what steps, and preferably a small number of steps, do I have to do so I don't have to deal with 1 million data points. And by the way, my boss cares about the overall risk, not just about the technology part. So how do I put it into a larger context? And I got to do this over and over again with information that's changing. And by the way, I want to do this in a way so that I don't have to prove to every individual auditor that walks in here I did the right thing. I want to do it in a way that's very public, right? Based on public sources, in a way that is shareable, demonstrable, and I don't have to on my own figure out how to prove I've done the right stuff. So this is the nature of the kind of problems that we have. So one of the things that I've done in this is not a sales pitch for the top 20 critical security controls. Some of you know what that is, but this has been my project. This literally started, anybody here familiar with this? Think of this as the priority scheme. This literally started when I was struggling with the fog of more problem on behalf of my customers at NSA. And the best customers, they loved our advice, but they said, Tony, we don't know what to do first. We don't know what to do in the next 6 months. Help us get down to basics. What should we get started on? I called 5 of the smartest people I knew within NSA, tech lead for the red team, the blue team, one from the threat operations, one from the dark side. And I said, no one leaves the room until you agree on a small number of things that everybody should do if you care about their security. Okay? Small meant 5 or 7 to me. At the end of the day, we came up with a list of 10. That list went down to some friends at the Pentagon and various places. That list got snarfed up by the SANS Institute, who turned it into this kind of worldwide, 10,000 friends activity as represented here, right? So if you look in this list, I know there are many experienced professionals here, you won't see a bit of a surprise, right? This list comes from prioritization, from people that I trust, and then by extension, lots more, who've put their heads together and said, we need to do these things first. Not to solve world hunger, not to completely get rid of the problem, but to get going, to build a foundation. And I'm a big, pragmatic kind of person. Pareto principle, does that ring a bell? 80-20 rule, okay? We could spend forever thinking about that last 10% of this job and never get anything done. We need to get going. There's a great quote from one of the SANS instructors. It's so good, I wish I had said it. The problem with the InfoSec business is all the experts agree on 90% of what needs to get done. They agree 90% of the time on 90% of what gets done. But they spend 90% of their day arguing to the death about the last 10%. Okay? That's the world that you grew up in. Some of you are like that. I've hired a gazillion people like that. I was like that once. All right? If we argue over the last 10%, we never get the 90 done. Let's get to work on that. That's kind of the philosophy that's behind this. So, that original list, and here's the real summary of what I want to tell you today. Okay? That original list was developed the way we do a lot of things in this business. I grabbed 5 friends I trust. But that's not good enough. It's good enough to have got this to a certain point. And then I told you the SANS Institute took it and said, I got 10,000s of friends on a mailing list. Let's get lots of people involved, right? So you extend and you say, okay, I'll trust the collective wisdom here. Here's what we're doing now, is going back to look at how to bring more rigor, more data underneath the hood, aiming for those attributes I told you about. So if you want an example of where I'm going, go look at the Verizon report. The Verizon guys are right here on the floor, right? Look at their data breach investigations report, I think they call it, 2014, and actually you can go back to look at 2013. Look at the summary, the conclusions, the recommendations. For the last 2 years, instead of just saying a few nice things, hey, here's right, remember the model, real data, here's the analysis, here's the summary of the problems. Now what it does, I gather volunteers, that's the business model of the Council on Cybersecurity. I gather volunteers, work voluntarily with Verizon in this case. We put our heads together and we map from their categories of problems identified by data into categories of potential solutions, which is what that little colorful wheel was, right? That's a pretty tempting thing for me. And then you can walk out on this floor and many of these vendors, including some of my closest partners like Qualys and Tripwire, they now market their products against those controls. Okay, they say, Mr. Customer, I help you with control number 1, 2, 3, and 4. So look at the data flow now. Real data, summary, categorization of problem, map to categorization of possible solutions, now map to specific choices in the marketplace that you can make. So you move from magic and trust me to choosing defenses that help you solve specific problems that have been identified by data. Okay? I like that model. That's the best we got right now. I've worked with mathematicians. I have one. I'm a reformed mathematician my entire life. They've got beautiful mathematical models that often don't have anything to do with reality. What I'm trying to do is build from reality up, from the data that we already have, people are collecting, analyzing, and making sense of. So that was the start. That's where we're going. We're now adding new friends. We just finished. We have a draft mapping right now running between some volunteers and Hewlett-Packard. I can name a few others to you. Symantec and McAfee have agreed to do the same. We're starting on drafts for them. So what we're doing, just look around. Anybody that's got a real report that comes out every quarter or every year, it's based on real data, I'm talking to them. All right, let's recreate this model. Let's do something like this. Let's help clear up some of this fog for all these great people out here. And we're going to do a round of this over the summer. After I do the first half a dozen, I'm going to go back to that crew and say, you know what makes this challenging? Every one of you uses different words, different categories, different bins, and every time we try to map from what you've learned to what we ought to do, it's kind of tedious. Can we all agree on language, on workflow, on categorization? Right? How many of you are familiar with like low-level indicators like STIX, TAXI, the SCAP, CVE, all that kind of stuff? Okay, what we're really doing is we're coming from the top to meet those things in the middle, and I've been a sponsor and advocate for all those things. So what we're doing is creating a more structured way to go from authoritative statements of what's wrong to what we ought to do about it. Not individually, but as a community, using volunteers, organizing them in this kind of fashion. Right? Does this make sense to you? This is what my passion is about. This is what I think we need to do. This is the kind of activity, just one example of the kinds of things that the council is trying to do. So The other thing we're doing is we're aligning this kind of idea, because we all live in a world of frameworks and compliance and things we have to report to. So our first step is we're going to align this. How many of you have been following the NIST cybersecurity framework? All right. Many of you realize there is no threat model built into it, right? You understand that, right? There's no priority scheme. It points to FISMA. It points to ISO. It points to us. What we're doing, I'm going to build an explicit, open, right, community-generated threat model that allows us to prioritize within that framework, so that if you want to follow the framework, you don't do it by yourself. You can at least get 80, 90% of the way there with what we're doing here. And we're just giving that away, okay? Because that's the right answer. That's the way we need to solve this problem. Okay, so we're going to align ourselves. We like peaceful coexistence. We're doing this in a very open community way. If you wonder, how do we get this kind of stuff done? I won't go through this here. But we need to do this as a community, right? For all those reasons I talked about in here. Because none of us can solve this on our own. None of us is big enough to shape the view of any vendor on our own. None of us is big enough to convince every auditor on our own. We have to do this as a community. So where's the manpower and the brain power coming to do this? Around folks like in this room. In fact, some of you are out there. Some of my volunteers are out here, right? And we're doing this not because this is the source of riches and fame. It's because we need to do this. You would not be in this business if you didn't care about issues like privacy, security, right? If you didn't love technology and want to see it safely applied, right, for your use and your children's use and so forth. And that's what drives a lot of us in this business. All I'm trying to do, Jane and I in the Council on Cybersecurity, is provide a way for us to come together, not to talk and say nice things and kumbaya together, but to do something, right? To create things that we can then all use. So if you're intrigued by this idea, you want to be a part of it, go to our website, sign up for the mailing list. If you think you got the talent and the energy and the passion to be a volunteer for this kind of stuff, we'll find a way to get you involved. So with that, I'm going to wrap it up. So now you get those magic words, right? It's great to be the pre-lunch speaker. You get to hear those magic words. And in conclusion, thank you all very much for your time. It's always a pleasure to be back here at that black hat on the stage and sharing a message with you. Thank you all very much.